me say a very good morning and how privileged I am to be present on this occasion, which I believe will prove to be a very momentous occasion, the launch of a fellowship that is bristling with possibilities and potential at a time when what we need is something as important as this. I have known Nataraj, as I call him, Dr. Nat, as many of you know him, for several decades now. We have done quite a few things, had a few adventures of the intellectual variety in our time. And I'm not surprised that this restless soul now comes up with this very, very, very important and crucial initiative, which speaks to our times in many ways and speaks to the future, particularly for the millennial generation. My own background as both a media practitioner, media thinker, or a media writer in the media, and having transited to education. We run a college in Chennai in India called the Asian College of Journalism. I've had occasion to think about the uselessness to a large extent of the normative formal education we are going through, and the need, therefore, for something fresh, innovative, out of the box, and relevant to our times and to the issues of our times, to the concerns of our times, to replace it. And I think the Gandhi-Mandela-Friere Foundation, the initiative, seems to be the initiative that we need for our times. I have looked at the idea of education, and we know that education itself has gone through what we call disruption in the new media sense of the term, in terms of digital disruption, in terms of the idea of the brick and mortar university being replaced by variants on the online face of education. We have seen edutech platforms take over this whole space and become profiteering rackets. We have seen the education becoming a process of recolonizing the mind, whereas the three figures we speak to today, whether it was Gandhi or Mandela or Freire, spoke about what they did or did what they did in the context of decolonization. It was part of the effort of decolonization, or in that process, that their messages, their philosophies became so relevant and became so definitive and formative, shall we say, of the century that ensued. Whereas we find today, the role of education largely seems to be reactionary in that sense, in the normative sense, unfortunately, in the normative educational field, that there's a neo-colonial kind of process at work, where the status quo, the bad and the indifferent and all that is unjust in the status quo seems to be legitimized through the framework of education. And that, I think, is one of the biggest pitfalls of education, and therefore the need for disruption in that educative process, in that linearity of that education. Technology comes to our aid in many ways, because digital technology, I think, as I'll try to set out, privileges an upending of the process of thinking in a particular manner for a long time. It was Thomas Paine, one of the stalwarts of the American independence movement, who in that very important book called Common Sense, which was considered like the Bible, if you like, in a political sense, the political Bible, if you like, of the American independence movement, says, and I quote, "A long habit of not thinking a thing right gives it a superficial appearance of being wrong." I'm sorry, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right, and raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of custom. But the tumult soon subsides. time makes more converts than reason. We have a similar situation now, I think, in the stereotypical normative educational field today. The context of education, the need for education, the need for of thinking anew, of refreshing our minds, of resetting, shall we say, our mental processes so that they are in sync with the requirements, with the crying needs, with the felt needs of the day, are not addressed by education, particularly in the higher education realm. And therefore, it's a process, it's a kind of going through the motions, partly for reasons of getting a job, perhaps, partly for having a qualification which makes you an eligible, shall we say, citizen in a very narrow sense of the term, none of which should really have been the reason for education. And if you look at the context of Mahatma Gandhi or Paulo Freire or Nelson Mandela, they were not formal education champions in that sense. Paulo Freire, of course, spoke about an alternative blueprint. He spoke about the need really to upend education when the idea of disruption, as in the new media that we speak about, was not even a coinage, was not even a term, was not even currency, if you like. Gandhiji spoke about alternative forms of education. He in fact offered to run his own education system or his own learning process at the Tolstoy Farm in South Africa for both his children, and I note that his distinguished granddaughter is here with us today, as well as the other students or the children of other satyagrahis at the Tolstoy Farm. Mandela was thrown out of college as an undergraduate in South Africa because of political activity on the campus. And yet, when you look at the Livonia Trials, which took place, which then put him in prison for 27.5 years from 1964 to 1990. In fact, I think he was in prison. His ID tag said he was in prison for life plus 5 years. In other words, he had a posthumous plus 5 years just to make sure that he didn't rise from the grave and create a problem even after he died. That was his sentence. So and yet when you read his defense in the Livonia Trials, when he talks about how an unjust law can't be a law per se. I mean, it's an idea of St. Augustine, a very deep idea that Martin Luther King spoke about, how unjust laws have to be broken, unjust laws have to be fought against, have to be struggled against, because they are not legal. And this is an idea that great thinkers always come up with. And that is the functional aspect of education. To be functional, to question, to interrogate, to question. That is the essence of education. I remember many years back when I was in college, early years of college and undergrad, and a self-acclaimed rebel, because we all like to think we are rebellious at a particular age. I attended a series of lectures by one of the well-known educationists in India, and I suspect many of you would have heard his name as well, J. Krishnamurti, who has in fact initiated a whole process of education, which is very philosophical, which has spiritual underpinnings without being religious in any sense. And there's a school of education which is followed, which is the Krishnamurti School of Education. I remember attending his lectures. He gave a series of lectures at the headquarters of the Krishnamurti Foundation here in Chennai, with the purpose of questioning and tripping him up, because after his lecture, he'd allow time for question answers. And in one of those lectures, after he had spoken, I in fact forget now the context of the lecture or the content, but I just remember my bravado. I raised my hand and I said, I have a question. And he said, he addresses everyone as a sir, whether you're a young man or an elder man. He said, yes, sir. And I said, I have a question. And then I asked my question, which is a very complex and convoluted question, I suspect, about something he had spoken. At the end of which he patiently asked me, is that, sir, a question? I said, yes, of course it is. He said, because a question must come from a quest. Is this a question, or are you trying to trip me up? Is this one-upmanship? Are you trying to prove that you know this better than I do? Because if that's the idea, I accept defeat. If it's a question, I'll try to address this. So the idea of questioning of interrogating what is happening with the idea of the curiosity, driven by the curiosity, not in terms of one-upmanship, not in terms of ideological combativeness, not in terms of proving that this or that philosophy, this or that trajectory, this or that idea is superior, whether it's a religious idea or a philosophical idea or an ideology itself, is, I think, key to the idea of education. To engender, to promote, to create that sense of quest, that sense of curiosity, that sense of challenge and curiosity in understanding the world. And I think all the three great men, the figures in whose name the fellowship, the fellowship, or whose names are embodied in the fellowship, so to speak, had that quality, a freshness of quality, not depending on what went before them, of thinking afresh. And it's not something they pull out of thin air. It's something that struggle and thought and action have yielded. I've read, for instance, that Mahatma Gandhi's idea of satyagraha occurs to him because of his constant writings with his pages, with his engagement with what he wrote. I mean, he was perhaps one of the greatest journalists the world has ever seen, and therefore he's of inspiration to any journalist, like Karl Marx himself was, for instance. He was editing 5 or 6 journals at the same time, and it was his dialogue with Indian opinion, with the pages of the Indian opinion which he edited, that gave him the idea of satyagraha, of this weapon of truth to fight the colonizers. That was the context. And it's very significant that he uses this in a very novel way. It was not something which had a precedent. Of course, there was the idea of non-violence, there was the idea of pacific resistance and all of that. We know that satyagraha is way beyond that. That satyagraha is not just passive resistance, because passive resistance is a tactic or a strategy at best, because if push comes to shove, passive resistance can move to active resistance, because you're unable to have any other means of fighting what needs to be fought. You resort to passive resistance. Whereas in Gandhi's case, satyagraha was a idea, a conviction that you are wedded to, and you don't depart from that. And he had developed it to perfection, and he had, of course, lived it. I mean, he led by his own example. Likewise, Mandela in his Livonia Trials, there's a wonderful tract by Derrida which speaks about Mandela, the Livonia Trials, where he is questioning, in fact, the accuser becomes the accused. He turns tables on those who are the prosecutors, literally. And he says, there is no way I can follow this law, because I respect the law. That, he says, I respect the law. I respect Magna Carta. I respect the principles of democracy and liberalism, even though it's from the West. I'm not one of those, like, say Marxists who say, I'll throw it overboard. In fact, although he had deep Marxist convictions, he says that in the trial. But he says, in order to respect the law must be legal. Karl Marx says this in a different context. He says, for instance, he was against censorship. I mean, it's a little difficult to, believe this, or, this sounds incredible because we associate Soviet or communist societies with press censorship, right? Whereas Marx spoke so eloquently against censorship that there's almost a kind of discordant note there. And at one point he says, censorship can never be the law, censorship can never be legitimate, even when it is a law, just as slavery can never be legitimate, even when it is a law. Because in those days, slavery was legal, and yet it was illegitimate, right? That's the point. So a way of looking at things afresh, looking at what is happening around you with a clear mind, with a curious mind, questioning it, interrogating it on first principles, bringing the touchstone of conscience, as we are speaking here, and conviction to all that is happening around us. Not going by the precedents, not going by what has been told to us, not going by prescriptions that are floating around us, that are in your face. This, I think, is the real value of education, the primary value of education. And I think a fellowship like the GMF Fellowship will create this paradigm shift, which implies a disruption, Luckily, I think we are at that inflection point, if you like, where the technologies available to us, the digital technology particularly, has already given a big body blow to the whole accreted culture of stereotypical thinking, of status quo thinking, which has only made the condition, the human condition, worse, not better than before. It's probably benefited a few people, made millionaires and digital capitalists of a few, but the majority of the people in the world, not just in economic or financial terms, but also in intellectual and moral terms. We need to retrieve, as I think Dr. Biju mentioned, we need to retrieve and reclaim the essence of education. The essence, we need to find again the moral compass that should guide us. That should be the role of education. That certainly would be the role of education. A normal or a nominal new education policy is not going to give you that. You might have cosmetic changes. You might mix and match. You might say that you can be an engineering student and learn music and football at the same time as part of your curriculum. All that is fine. But unless there is this core vision of creating something that is transformative, that's the key word. It has a transformative effect. Then there is no role for education. There's no real reason for education. And I think this is what the fellowship, I hope, will, I'm sure it will, from the initial conversations I've had with Dr. Nat, will, I think, bring to bear on our times. The advantage of the disruptive model of the digital technology is that it has actually moved away from the analog mode of thinking into a digital mode of thinking. At least the millennial generation, I think, does. This means paradigm shifts in many big ways. It means that some things that we considered, shall we say, or assumed to be, as I said, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong, we thought were important, need to be questioned. And if we find that they are no longer relevant or important, thrown overboard. Because I think we have shifted from a realm of what you call heights and depths into a realm of breadth, if you like. That's one of the big shifts that's taken place with the new technology, with the digital mindset, with the digital cognitive mindset. Because the analog mindset tells us this follows, this follows, this follows. There's a linearity. There's an inexorable linearity in the way our thinking process, our lifestyle, our value judgments proceed. And unless that is broken at some point, unless there is a disruption at that, in that process, we will never be able to think out of the box, never be really able to be innovative. This is not a radical revolutionary idea. It's not a extremism. It's not terrorism of the mind, or it's not intellectual terrorism of any kind. It is the way to correct course, to make meaning out of a totally indifferent dispensation or regime that we now call education. And that the digital technology which enables a digital culture and a digital mindset, a digital thinking process, enables that. And we can see this operating already, willy-nilly, irrespective of, despite perhaps the formal education process in the millennial generation. I have seen this in generation after generation, I mean, in class after class after class at the ACJF over the last 2 decades. Because the idea that height and depth, which is prescribed, are all important and you need to subscribe to it, makes you already compliant, makes you already capitulate, makes you already less thinking. That's not the one to be taken for granted. Principles are, scientific principles are, and so on. There's no doubt about that. There's no reason, because we are living in an age of various kinds of tyrannies, apart from the tyranny of the majority, which we in India are experiencing on a daily basis. There's the tyranny, intellectual tyranny of the rating system, for instance. When you go to a bookshop, who says these are the first 100 books, first 10 books? But they are there. And you've automatically already kind of circumscribed your intellectual horizons, your mind, and you're operating only within the framework of that short list, what you call the rating system. Music, top 10 labels, top 20 labels. Or of course, in the media, TRP, what you call, television rating points or viewers ratings points. determine advertising, and you find that operating in a far more patent and manifest manner there. But I'm saying it's there. This whole idea of subscribing to what is prescribed and set and hierarchized and shown as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and these are the top 10, top 10, top 10, top 100, top 50. Whereas hardly 100 years back, the biggest achievements in science and technology were achieved against the grain of the popular. It is not populist as a lot of this is today. Because if you go back to the earlier centuries, when all of mankind or all right-thinking people, in inverted commas, thought the earth was flat, some people came along and said, no, the earth seems to be round. And the first lot of people who said that were burnt at the stake. If someone proposed the Copernican revolution and spoke about the solar system as we understand it today, that would have been blasphemous. In fact, people were burnt at the stake for that. It was considered blasphemous. So in science and math, the biggest achievements were against the grain of the popular, because of curious minds, not because of universities or formal teaching methods or things like that. And that is why I think we have to rethink the idea of university, if that's the term we want to use, or of learning, or of a voyage of discovery, which is what I think the formal training methods or learning methods should be all about. And therefore it is that Paulo Freire, who I think is the nodal presence here. Gandhi and Mandela are inspirational presences, but the person who addressed himself to education per se, the specialist, if you like, in the trio, would be Paulo Freire as an educationist. And he speaks about problematizing. He in fact, for someone we associate with, shall we say, with spirituality, with the baggage of, shall we say, spiritualism, he said education should never ever be a process of a mission. It's not a missionary's job. It should never be like a missionary's job. It's not you go out there and convert people to this line of thinking or that line of thinking. It has to be a process of problematizing, of interrogating, and of being convinced by not being convinced. I mean, as he puts it beautifully, he says that that's the way to look at education. And and to have the humility in order to be always tentative about your knowledge, not to be absolutist about it, not to be totalitarian about it. Not humility also in the other sense. These days, humility is used as political.
Mr. Sasi Kumar, you are on mute now suddenly.
Oh, sorry. Have I been on mute from the beginning?
No,
sorry.
Just a while ago. No.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know that. All right. So humility. I was saying Paulo Freire speaks about humility. The need to have open-ended, to be tentative about things. We talk about having the courage of your conviction, but you must first know that your conviction is true. And therefore, you must be tentative about the conviction. You must constantly question, constantly interrogate, constantly problematize. I think that's the idea of humility. Not humility in a political proprietary sense, for instance. As I was saying, humility, as someone said, I think it was Bernard Shaw, humility is like underwear, good if it's hidden, bad if it's seen. So not the humility that is worn on your sleeve and that we are commonly used to. Humility in a deep spiritual sense. A sense of dialogue. That dialogue is part of learning process. After all, Socrates is perhaps the archetypal model, the oral dialogue process. It's Jesus Christ didn't write what he did. Subsequently, decades later, we wrote and we had the testaments. The prophet did not write what he spoke about. Much later, what he spoke about was written. The Buddha, or I mean, any Hinduism, of course, has always been an oral tradition. In fact, there was a ban on writing for the wrong reasons, because you wanted to have the privileged pundits and the priestly class alone to have access to all the information. So the oral tradition, the tradition of dialogue and discussion, not a prescriptive curricular model. The curricular model of education itself is, to my mind, faulty from the word go. Because you set a curriculum, you prescribe a curriculum, and people follow a curriculum, and they become, mimetic parasites of that curriculum. That's what we get. As against that, and Paulo Freire's terminology, that the teacher is never a teacher alone, he's also ipso facto, or she is also ipso facto a learner. The idea of teacher-learner, it's a compound verb. When you're teaching, you're learning. When you're learning, you're teaching. So this is a different relationship, a teacher-student relationship as well. And the idea of education being about knowing, not about gathering and creating information, not about scoring marks, but about knowing and transfiguring yourself, and therefore being in a position to play a transformative role in society itself. So these are many important ways in which Mandela has, as I said, pointed out how education can play such a big role. And therefore, I think I'm running out of my time as well. I think we must look at this initiative as a golden opportunity to create a different paradigm of education. When you say different paradigm of education, commonly what happens is educationists rush to the scene and set up the new education policy in the Indian context, or equivalents of that elsewhere in the world. We speak in terms of known frameworks. The idea is to equip people. Education is not only about literacy. Of course, literacy is probably part of it. It's important. Adult literacy was very important for Paulo Freire as well. So I think it's important to look at these processes of disruption, to look at moving from the linear to the non-linear, because that is an advance. It's not a step back. Moving from the idea of a particular heritage or legacy into making a quantum leap into something new, if that's what it takes to bridge time and space, and the fruits that these will bring you. So these are, I think, the ways in which to look in an adventurous sense, if you like, not in an irresponsibly adventurous, but with a sense of insouciance at the idea of education. And that education is what I think the Gandhi-Mandela-Friere Fellowship will offer. That's my trust, that's my hope. And I'm sure that there is a silent but important section of society, civil society. There are people out there who are waiting for something like this to happen, because it is a long felt need, but it's an area where no one, for some reason, has been able to take the initiative and make it sustainable. Even Paulo Freire would seem to many people, something like a very, very radical revolutionary. If you spoke about whereas what he was saying, every word of it made very real sense. And therefore, I'd like to wish the GMF all the very best. I'd like additionally to say, I, both in my personal capacity and institutionally, would be happy to do whatever we can to help this initiative forward. I've already told Dr. Nat that we'll be happy to receive the fellows, for instance, at the Asian College of Journalism for a stipulated period of time to participate and take a look at a ringside view, if you like, of how another area of curiosity works, that of the journalist, of understanding his context. There's a lot that's wrong with journalism, and that's why you need better journalism now. You need a transformative journalism now. You need journalism which is not just voyeurism or keyhole journalism or doing all the wrong things, but making a difference to your context, to the people around you. It has a transformative value. As a famous journalist from this part of the world, Tarzi Vitachi from Sri Lanka, said, information without transformation is sheer gossip. That, I think, is as valuable a lesson for journalism as for education. Information, if it's pure information without transformation, it's sheer gossip. It has no value. There must be a transformative element that's intrinsically a part of it. So I wish the GMF all the very best, and I'm sure with energized and committed and convinced people like Dr. Nat and others who are behind it, it will be there. And I once again want to offer my support to the extent that I can provide it, and that of the Asian College of Journalism. Thank you very much.